My name's Jena. I use they, them pronouns, and I live in Western Massachusetts, but I grew up in rural Vermont, in northern Vermont, and I work for an agency called Community Action, and they work in their youth and workforce development programs. And my title is as a youth access partnership coordinator. And the project that I'm working on is grounded in positive youth development frameworks to increase access to quality healthcare for LGBT youth and youth of color and folks with different experiences that create challenges.
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to know about the project?
Well, I'm interested in like how much I should have my like JOB hat on and how much as like a person in queer community or someone who like grew up in Vermont. Yeah, so kind of what perspectives you're looking for.
I think those are all really important perspectives. I don't know what Davey thinks, but I mean, oh, sorry, you can go first.
To put it in context, we're interviewing a total of 9 or 10 people.
Yeah.
All but one are queer or trans or both. And most also work with young people, but only a few grew up in Vermont. So I think you can speak from all those perspectives, but that one will be the more unique piece, I think.
Sure. Well, there wasn't really anything where I grew up at all, and like, or any awareness or any resources. It like really like wasn't anything that I have any like grounded experience in until like leaving Vermont. So I guess maybe that's useful to talk about at some point.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a thing about rural communities, that the queer youth leave.
Yeah.
Is like even in rural communities that are full of a lot of accepting people, there may not be a lot of the resources, and the resources are really important. And there also are just not as many queer people in places where there aren't as many people, and so it's hard to find that community. I mean, that's my experience anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know what queerness was or gender was. I'd never heard of anything of that. I didn't know anybody. Nobody talked about it. There was like maybe one gay kid at our high school that like people were like, what's that? It was like, no resources, but I don't know if we're like getting into things yet, but something that has been cool that as an older adult was able to go back to Vermont and work at Camp Outright with through Outright Vermont, which is a summer camp for LGBT youth in Starksboro, which is like the town next to mine. So like go back to the place I was and get to like be a queer adult and supporting queer youth. It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's really great. Yeah, I know some people who went there. So I have a couple of more general questions that we're asking everyone. The first one being, what do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
Well, that's something that I happen to do a lot of work around in my job, where I'm working with queer and trans youth to hear from them. What do they want? What do they need in terms of access to healthcare or meeting their basic needs? And overall, astoundingly, what I hear from youth, particularly queer and trans youth, is that they want to be listened to and valued in their community and be given real information and trusted and validated in their experience. Also see youth and young adults, particularly queer and trans youth, really want access to gender-affirming healthcare, including puberty blockers, trans-competent therapists, trans kind of specific like places to work out and work with personal trainers. They want service animals. opportunities in the community to do things that are fun and meaningful and be around positive people. Queer and trans youth want people to call them by the right pronouns and their names, and to be able to have like access to opportunity, transportation.
Yeah, definitely. So since some of these topics are not going to be things that people may have background knowledge with, would you mind explaining a little bit about gender affirming healthcare and what that can look like?
I could talk a lot about that, but I would summarize that around gender affirming healthcare on one level being able to physically get to or access a doctor who will listen and affirm and believe you, and also have the skills or knowledge to be able to provide gender transition related care. So for younger youth, that could be access to puberty blockers to delay the onset of puberty changes, or hormone replacement therapy to transition gender biologically, I guess, and as well as access to gender affirming surgical care. So that's kind of like one piece of it, but also to have gender affirming therapists, so like a therapist that will have some understanding and framework of like what gender is and how to support somebody in exploring and coming and connecting with their own experience of gender, without pathologizing or kind of convincing somebody out of it. There's a long history of a lot of harm in the medical system around queer and trans folks, including like literal like gender and sexual orientation conversion therapy. So affirming being like can mean a whole bunch of things, but I think a pretty good like low bar is like believing and validating what somebody believes to be true about their own experience.
Thank you. And another question that we had is, what do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
One of the things that I love about queer and trans youth is that they have such expansive ways of thinking about gender and sexuality. Something that like really blew my mind even like 6 or 8 years ago when I was working at Camp Outright for LGBT youth, was just like how nonlinear young folks are thinking about gender. Like some of older generations is like, oh, well, there's more than male or female. And they're like, well, actually, I'm not just non-binary. I'm also like genderqueer, and I'm also like masculine, but I'm also like femme, and like I'm like a gender constellation that like doesn't even fit on a line. And so I just like feel like so inspired the ways that not only young folks can think outside the box, but they can create really their own like frameworks and metaphors for understanding their experience. In general, I think youth and young adults bring a lot of asset to their community in terms of creativity, new and generative ideas, as well as a lot of capacity for building relationships and developing their own values.
Oh, absolutely, thank you. So what would you say to well-meaning adults in the community who are new to thinking about gender and sexuality and who aren't sure what to do or say?
So if you're new to gender or sexuality and it's outside of your frame of reference, my first like advice would to try to take that with humility and recognize what an opportunity is that someone is investing trust and time and energy to help you understand their experience. So being gracious when someone corrects you or tries to tell you about their experience, like you have an opportunity for learning. And we might kind of see ourselves as wanting to be good people who do the right thing, and it might be hard to get feedback that you're not kind of hitting that mark for somebody, but knowing that you can be a good person and make mistakes, and it's how you handle that really matters. So be willing to acknowledge when you don't know something or when you make a mistake, and focus your energy on listening and affirming what people tell you.
That's a great answer. So I also have a few questions about media that we wanted to ask people. So where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in TV or in film?
I don't really watch a lot of TV or movies, to be honest, because there's not a lot of good representation, and even kind of what representation there is can be pretty tokenizing and or kind of like a similarist into like normative values. And it's also really hard for me to pick out TV shows and movies on Netflix. But I see youth feeling kind of most affirmed and connected with memes on the internet, which is a little bit outside of my scope of experience, but youth seem to really find a lot of affirmation and positive representation in memes. I also know that youth really love Steven Universe as a TV show too. But I think just the fact that there are even like shows or TV that has characters and representation. I tend to read a lot more books than I watch TV. So I love reading young adult novels because they're like really earnest and tender a lot of the time. And I'm seeing like a lot of development of non-binary and queer and trans characters in books. And I think that like having more non-binary representation or just like the process of questioning gender is actually still pretty new in novels. So I see a lot of expansion in that in young adult novels.
Yeah. It's actually the next question I was going to ask you is where you see positive representation in film. Sorry, I already said that. In literature. So you've kind of already gone into that. Are there any particular books or particular authors where you think that you're seeing positive representation?
Well, I think two of my favorite young adult novels around queer and trans youth, who are actually also Black and brown youth, is The Space and the Stars Between Us. And then the other one is Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera. So I can't remember the author of the first one, but Gabby Rivera also writes for Marvel's America Chavez comic, which is also really gay and queer and amazing and like a powerful superhero like graphic novel series. So I would recommend those.
I love graphic novels and I actually have not heard of that. So I will definitely check it out. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a comic book, like they're issues, but I would highly recommend it.
Jena, is that first one that you mentioned, the stars and the blackness between them?
Yeah.
I think you said it backwards, but someone just recommended that to me, and now I'm on an 8-month-long waiting list to get it from the library.
Oh my gosh, I probably did say it backwards, but I bought it, and it's like one of my favorite novels, so I would buy it. It's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also just read Felix Everlasting, which is about a trans youth as well. I didn't like that one as much, but it was still made me cry.
Even being a recent young adult, there was not like that much representation. It sounds like even though we have a long way to go, there is a little bit more. And I definitely agree with you that a lot of the representation that we do have isn't that great. And I think one of the issues that we see sometimes is people who interpret all representation as, good representation. It's not all positive all the time. So we did want to ask people about where they found positive representation, so that, people who are watching this can find those, because media can absolutely be a positive resource.
Totally.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also I feel like media is not always a very like positive representation of like what healthy relationships are or effective communication. So like being like a young queer watching the original L Word you know, like in hindsight, I'm like, wow, those are like really unhealthy and codependent and like violent relationships. And so like, I feel like that's really complicated that that's like the most iconic like representation of like lesbian girl culture. And they were like really transphobic too and racist. So it's complicated.
That is such a great point. Like, unhealthy relationships are definitely glorified in media, and I feel like that happens a lot with queer relationships in media.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I never watched The L Word, probably because of my age. But yeah, I heard about some of the transphobia and racism, and I was like, okay, guess I'm
Yeah.
not gonna watch it.
Yeah, I think most youth would be horrified by it now.
Yeah. What do you wish that you had learned as a kid or youth about gender and sexuality that you didn't learn until later?
Well, I would have liked to learn about gender and sexuality. I would have liked to know I would have liked to know that there was options and that everything that we're taught by society is not compulsory and you actually get to make an active decision about who you are and how you want to be. Um, I think like the compulsory and like default of like assigned sex at gender or assigned gender at birth and just like really sucked, and I just didn't have any like models or any ideas that there anything else existed until like way later in my life. So I would have liked to known that there's like more options, and also like how liberating it is to not um, participate in harmful dynamics that our culture sets us up in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also would have loved to learn about queer safer sex, even not just as a youth, but even as a young adult.
Yeah, that's missing from a lot of sex ed. You know, a lot is missing from sex ed, but I think that's really one of the most glaring things is the complete lack of discussion of gender and sexuality, and the fact that when they talk about safer sex, it's like very heteronormative, very cisnormative.
Totally. I really wish that I had also learned when I was younger around consent and boundaries and having a right to set and maintain boundaries for myself and my body. It's really important and wish I had learned about that too.
Me too. Absolutely. Yeah, I really wish I had too. As someone who grew up in Vermont, I did also want to ask you, how might queer and trans youth in rural areas have different needs than in cities? And also, how can rural areas be supportive places for queer and trans youth and adults?
Well, I think there can often be this idea that if you live somewhere rural, there's nothing to offer and that's just inherently bad and you should just leave and go live in a city. But I actually really love living rurally. That's why I love living in Western Mass, because it's like where I grew up, but it's not where I grew up. So I think that one real barrier is transportation, particularly in accessing resources or healthcare, like, and just being really spread out. That like I lived about 45 minutes from Burlington, which is impossible to get to if you don't have a car because there's no public transportation. And I've heard stories of other queer youth having to travel 2 to 3 hours in order to see a doctor or a therapist. So I think that's a pretty unique barrier. Although I'm really excited about the possibilities of online technologies now that has actually like been a silver lining of COVID, of offering telehealth and online support as new options. So when I grew up, the internet was like kind of just getting going, but there was like you could like message and chat with people, but I didn't really know about any like resources online so much. So I think that there's a lot of possibility to utilize technology as a way to connect across space and continue using telehealth as additional options for resources and be able to have more accessibility.
That is such a good point. I've had really great experiences with telehealth, and it isn't really something that I thought about before it became a replacement for in-person healthcare. And maybe we could incorporate it post-COVID, because I think that it is really important. It's a lot more accessible for a lot of people, and it would help people in rural areas. Absolutely.
Absolutely, but I think also kind of the flip side of that is then access to internet and
Yeah.
technology being a really big barrier. So I think also doing mobile outreach is a really great strategy as well for reaching rural communities.
Yeah, and actually, barriers to internet in rural communities it's another thing that can be difficult in terms
And
of
you
accessing
know,
online
it's
resources.
the focus of my role, but I think building relationships and partnerships across sectors and between schools and local communities, and as much as possible trying to integrate services into one place is also a helpful strategy.
Oh yeah. Could you talk about some of the work you've done in that area?
Absolutely. So the work that I do is a collaboration between our youth programs, where we do leadership and workforce development programming with youth, as well as with our community health center and behavioral health center, which are both co-located. So we're working as a team to integrate more youth access to healthcare and mental health care, as well as getting folks accessing healthcare connected in with community and peer supports.
Thank you. So do you work mostly like with youth, or do you work at all with younger kids?
I mostly work with youth and young adults. So for that, it looks like ages 14 to 24. So we have LGBT peer support group, youth of color peer support group, work with young parents, worked with young folks who have not finished high school, youth who have been in foster care, youth who have been involved with the criminal justice system, youth who are housing instability or houseless. So lots of different folks who might have experienced different and multiple overlapping oppressions.
Actually, my next topic was about that, about intersectionality within the queer community.
Black and brown, queer and trans youth, at the same time in unique ways experience potentially both racism as well as transphobia and homosexuality or homophobia, and the ways that each of those expressions are experienced are either racialized or gendered. And so folks that are experiencing racism in addition to transphobia and homophobia also are disconnected from their white peers in terms of their experience. And so they often have a higher level of burden and also not the same access. In terms of assets, I think that the flip side can be true, that if you have experienced oppression on multiple levels, you also have resilience and insight into what it's like to experience multiple experiences of oppression.
What could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for queer and trans youth of color?
Well, I think there's a lot of layers there, but I think that they can hire more Black and brown staff. They can hire more queer and trans staff. They can hire more Black and brown, queer and trans staff. And within that, cultivating skills within youth and young adults to be stepping into leadership and work experiences that are serving their own communities.
Thank you. What particular barriers do disabled and or neurodivergent LGBTQ people face? What particular strengths and assets do they bring? And what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for these youth?
Yeah, I think folks with disabilities and perhaps neurodivergence face a really ableist society and system, and that access needs are never or very seldom considered. So the spaces may not be designed for them to fully participate or even access that. Or it also puts the burden of that labor on individuals rather than recognizing how the system perpetuates that. So in terms of our spaces, like making sure that folks can get in the building and doors are wide enough, especially bathrooms, which is part of ADA compliance, but is not, it doesn't always happen. And make sure that spaces are fragrance free. Can also let people know what to expect in terms of giving like agendas or explaining the options. I think that's also part of like trauma-informed care, setting up the space intentionally so people can see where the exits are, giving different ways for folks to participate, giving roles or having kind of more strengths-based. So recognizing that there's different kind of ways to participate and knowing that not one way of participating is more valuable than others. So some people might feel really welcomed and belonging and able to speak in a group of people, and that might not be how everyone is able to participate. So offering different kind of structures or ways for folks to engage that values different engagement. Also, sorry, this is not exactly around disability, but is around access, that really making sure that in materials and forms and paperwork and posters are also translated into multiple languages, particularly around Spanish in terms of being able to offer access to more folks.
Definitely. I am myself a disabled and neurodivergent queer person, and I think those are really great answers because I have left queer spaces because of ableism. I have left queer spaces because they were not accommodating to my access needs.
Thank you for that, and I'm sorry that happened to you. That sucks.
Yeah, me too, but I have found some more welcoming spaces. I think in particular going to college has opened some of that up for me.
Yeah, one last thing I would give advice in terms of what folks can do is like create a channel or a way that you can ask people around their access needs and make that part of a regular way of preparing the space or your group, and checking back in with that, being willing to make adjustments. And even if you're not able to fix that, acknowledge like, yeah, that would be a really great thing to do. I can't really do that, and I'm sorry, that sucks. Because I feel like sometimes people with access needs, like if they can't meet it, kind of are like not willing to take responsibility for that. And that can just feel really invalidating if you're put in the labor and energy to advocate for what your access need is. And also in terms of like some of our group programming, like if we go on field trips, trying to think about how much walking is involved, if there's stairs, if there's going to be somewhere to sit down, and like letting people know what to expect around what's going to happen so they can make choices around if they're able to participate in that.
Yeah.
Jena, as you've been talking, I thought about a connection in a way I hadn't before, which is that being disabled or a person with a disability at any age in like interacting with the world is a lot the experience of encountering a system that was not built for you and trying to figure out how you can access it anyway.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about disabled adults who might feel like they have no idea how to relate to a queer or trans young person, but that's also really the experience of being queer or trans in the world, right? Is continually encountering systems that were not built for you and trying to access them anyway. So there's a point of connection there maybe that could be helpful for some folks.
Absolutely, like different experiences of oppression are not like comparable, but the thing that is that consistent thread, right, is that like trying to access a system that's not designed for you and doing it anyways, and finding workarounds and developing skills. I think about a lot of the work that I do is like harm reduction under capitalism and white supremacy. So until it topples, how can we make it less harmful and create more access for people?
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to say on this topic? of intersectionality within the queer community?
I think also recognizing that there's different levels of access to education or just even experience around learning different ways to talk about things. And just because someone hasn't learned like the queer lingo doesn't mean that they don't have valuable experience or things to contribute with that. I find that definitely can happen in some of our youth programs, that youth of color may not have had the same kind of like learn the same lingo as some of the white queer youth. And so to know that there's like a lot of different ways to be queer and that's just as valid. And so I think about working with youth and really anybody, that like trying to like avoid getting too academic or too jargony in language, and really try to like speak about what you mean and what you're trying to say, and have a conversation about what you really mean, so that like more people can participate in whatever the conversation is.
All right. And is there anything else that you would like to tell us on any topic, really?
Sure. Well, this is a little bit divergent, but I have a strong practice in yoga and meditation, and I find the practice of mindfulness and developing the tools of awareness and focus really so critical in noticing your own reactions and doing the work of slowing down and responding with compassion and curiosity rather than defensiveness and aggression. And so thinking about how we can build skills to examine racism and transphobia, that like developing the skills to be present with hard things and still engage, I think is really useful. So I'll put a plug for mindfulness with a breadth of integrity and context and history, to develop skills for awareness and undoing the frameworks and paradigms that are illusory around systems of oppression. And that really, there's so much to be done in relationship building and building of connections and valuing each other and being kind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for interviewing with us and your contributions to this project. It was really great to meet you and really great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was nice to meet you too, and appreciate you doing this project. And I think it's so cool that you're getting to make videos to share with other people, because I think that that's how change happens, is through relationship, and is hearing other people's experiences and seeing each other's humanity and helping them connect into their own humanity more so that it can show up for each other in solidarity.